Imagine a tent shredded from the inside out, abandoned in a wasteland of ice. Imagine 9 sets of footprints leading into the darkness, some barefoot, some in single socks, all marching towards certain death in temperatures 40 degrees below zero. This is not a campfire ghost story. It is a frozen snapshot of a reality so baffling that for 60 years it has defied every law of logic and every effort of the Soviet state to bury it. Welcome to Boring History. Today, we are not just looking at a cold case, we are stepping into the howling winds of the Ural Mountains to unmask the secret of Dyatlov Pass. In the winter of 1959, the Soviet Union was a place of rigid order and boundless ambition. The thaw under Nikita Khrushchev had begun, and the youth were eager to explore the vast, untamed reaches of their motherland. In the city of Sverdlovsk, a group of 9 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, the best and brightest of their generation, prepared for an expedition that would cement their status as master hikers. They were led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student whose name would soon become synonymous with one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. Dyatlov was a man of precision and steel, a leader who had navigated the wilderness many times before. His team was equally formidable. There was Yuri Doroshenko, a robust and dependable athlete, Lyudmila Dubinina, a tough economics student, Yuri Krivonischenko and Alexander Kolovatov, both skilled engineers, Zinaida Kolmogorova, whose journals reveal a heart full of fire, Rustem Slobodin, known for his endurance, Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignolles, a charismatic soul with a penchant for sketching, and finally, Semyon Zolotaryov, a 38-year-old veteran of the Great Patriotic War who had joined the group at the last minute, bringing a sense of grizzled experience to the youthful pack. Their objective was Mount Otorten, a peak in the northern Urals. To the local indigenous Mansi people, Otorten held a dark reputation. In their tongue, it translated loosely to, "Don't go there," and the mountain they had to pass to get there, Kholat Syakhl, carried an even more ominous moniker, the Dead Mountain. Legend said 9 Mansi hunters had once died there, an eerie foreshadowing of the number in the party led by Dyatlov. But these were Soviet students, raised on the rationalism of the state. They did not believe in spirits or ancient curses. They believed in maps, compasses, and the strength of the human will. On January 23rd, they boarded a train, their packs heavy with lard, crackers, and high-altitude gear. The photographs they left behind are haunting in their normalcy. We see them laughing, huddled together against the cold, their faces bright with the thrill of the unknown. They reached the small settlement of Vizhai on January 27th, the final outpost of civilization before the deep taiga. It was here that the first fraction in the mission occurred. Yuri Yudin, the 10th member, was struck by a debilitating bout of sciatica. His legs refused to carry him further. In a parting that would haunt him for the rest of his long life, he embraced his friends and turned back. He was the only one who would survive the winter. The remaining 9 pressed on, skiing deeper into the frozen heart of the Urals. The diaries they kept during these days are a testament to their grit. They spent hours breaking trail through snow 3 feet deep, their breaths turning to ice on their scarves. By January 31st, they reached the base of the highlands and constructed a storage cache to hide food and equipment they would not need for the final push to the summit. This was a tactical move, a sign of their expertise. On February 1st, they began the ascent through the pass. The plan was to cross the ridge and find shelter in the valley on the other side. However, the Ural weather is a fickle beast. A sudden, violent blizzard descended, swallowing the landscape in a whiteout. Visibility vanished. In the swirling chaos, the group drifted off course. Instead of crossing the pass, they found themselves climbing the exposed shoulder of Kholat Syakhl. As the dim Arctic sun began to set at 5 p.m., Dyatlov faced a critical decision. They could descend the mountain to the safety of the tree line, or they could make camp right there on the barren, wind-scoured slope. They stayed on the ridge to test their resilience, not wanting to lose the altitude they had gained. For reasons that remain debated to this day, Dyatlov chose the slope. They leveled the snow, pitched the tent, and anchored it with their skis. They crawled inside to escape the biting wind. Outside, the mountain seemed to turn against them, unaware their end approached.
Inside the tent, the air was thick with the scent of damp canvas and human breath. 9 hikers shared a space meant for half that number, their shadows flickering against the walls in the dim glow of a lantern. They were tired, yet the atmosphere remained disciplined. They ate a late dinner of cold ham and crackers, choosing not to light the wood-burning stove to save fuel and avoid the risk of fire in the cramped quarters. To pass the time, they composed a satirical newsletter they titled The Evening Otorten, filled with inside jokes about the rigors of the trek and the supposed presence of snowmen in the hills. It was a final, documented moment of normalcy. But as the night deepened, something shifted the reality of their survival into a nightmare. We do not know the exact moment, nor the specific sound, but something convinced these 9 seasoned outdoorsmen that staying inside that sanctuary meant certain death. Whatever occurred was so sudden that there was no time to unfasten the frozen ties of the tent's entrance. Instead, someone grabbed a knife and slashed through the heavy fabric from the inside, creating jagged exits. They spilled out into the sub-zero darkness, barely dressed for the elements. Some wore only socks, others were barefoot or in thin undershirts. In a temperature that plummeted toward minus 30 degrees Celsius, they began a desperate descent down the slope of Kholat Syakhl, moving toward the distant tree line. They left behind their boots, their heavy coats, and their survival gear. In the eyes of a historian, this is the most baffling detail. A group of experts knowingly walking into a lethal frost without the tools to endure it. The silence that followed lasted for weeks. Back in Sverdlovsk, the families of the hikers waited for the telegram Dyatlov had promised to send upon their arrival in Vizhay, expected no later than February 12th. When the date passed, there was initially no alarm. Delays were common in the unpredictable Ural wilderness. However, as mid-February arrived with no word, the anxiety of the parents and the sports club grew into a frantic demand for action. By February 20th, the first rescue parties were organized, consisting of student volunteers from the Polytechnic Institute. Soon, the search expanded to include the military and the police, with planes and helicopters scouring the white expanse of the Mountain of the Dead. On February 26th, the searchers Mikhail Sharavin and Boris Slobstov finally spotted a dark triangular shape protruding from the snow on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. As they approached, the gravity of the situation became clear. It was the tent, half collapsed and buried under a layer of fresh snow. It stood alone on the barren ridge, a haunting monument to a vanished expedition. When the searchers cut their way inside, they found a scene frozen in time. A plate of sliced bacon sat ready for a meal that was never finished. Jackets were neatly hung. A pair of felt boots, or valenki, stood waiting for feet that would never return. Most chillingly, the searchers noticed the knife marks on the tent's roof, confirming that the occupants had fled in a state of utter terror. There were no signs of a struggle with outside intruders. There were no footprints other than those of the hikers themselves. The searchers began to follow a trail of 8 or 9 sets of tracks leading down the hill toward the woods. These prints were preserved as raised pedestals of ice, formed when the warmth of a human foot compresses the snow before the wind erodes the loose powder around it. The tracks showed people walking, not running, which deepened the mystery. Why would they move at a calm pace into a blizzard that would inevitably kill them? The search party followed these ghostly prints for nearly a kilometer. At the edge of the forest, under the sprawling branches of an ancient Siberian cedar, they found the remains of a small fire. Charred twigs and a few larger branches lay scattered in the snow. And there, lying near the embers, were the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko. They were dressed only in their underwear, their hands burned and their fingers raw from climbing the cedar tree, as evidenced by the broken branches above them. It appeared they were trying to look back up the hill, perhaps searching for the tent or whatever had driven them from it. Their frozen forms marked the beginning of a grim recovery process that would soon reveal something far more harrowing than a simple case of exposure.
The recovery of the 2 Yuris was only the overture to a symphony of confusion. As the search party turned their gaze back toward the abandoned tent, a grim pattern began to emerge. Between the cedar and the ridge, 3 more bodies were discovered, spaced out as if marking a desperate, failed pilgrimage back to the safety of their gear. Igor Dyatlov, the group's namesake leader, was found roughly 300 meters from the tree. He lay on his back, one hand clutching a branch of birch, his face partially covered by snow. His eyes, fixed and glassy, were directed toward the slope he had been trying to ascend. He was inadequately dressed for the sub-zero temperatures, yet his frost claimed his heart. Further up the incline, they found Zinaida Kolmogorova. She was positioned even closer to the tent than Dyatlov. The searchers noted that she seemed to have been crawling, her body arranged in a dynamic pose that suggested a final, agonizing push through the drifts. There were traces of blood on the snow near her face, though no immediate source of a fatal wound was visible.
Finally, there was Rustem Slobodin. He was found between Dyatlov and Kolmogorova, buried under a layer of snow that had protected his form from the elements. Unlike the others, an initial examination revealed a small fracture in his skull, approximately 6 centimeters long. It was a significant injury, yet the medical examiners would later conclude it was not what killed him. Like the others found on the slope, Slobodin had succumbed to hypothermia, his body simply shutting down in the middle of his frantic retreat. For the next 2 months, the search transitioned from an active rescue to a grueling waiting game. The Siberian winter refused to relinquish its hold on the remaining 4 hikers. It wasn't until the spring thaw of May 1959 that the mountain finally offered up its final secrets. Under 4 meters of packed snow, in a ravine located about 75 meters into the woods beyond the cedar tree, the search party made a discovery that would transform a tragic accident into a terrifying enigma. They found Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolyadovov, and Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignolles. Unlike the first 5, these 4 were better dressed, appearing to have scavenged clothing from their fallen comrades. Dubinina, for instance, had wrapped her feet in a piece of Krivonischenko's wool trousers. They had also constructed a temporary shelter, a den of sorts, made from cedar branches and spare garments laid out on the frozen floor of the ravine. It appeared they had survived longer than the others, fighting for every second of life in the dark. The den was a testament to their survival instinct. They had cut 16 small fir trees and arranged them in a way that suggested they intended to wait out whatever horror had driven them from the tent. Yet they were found not in the den, but several meters away, at the bottom of the creek bed. However, when the bodies were finally excavated and brought to the morgue in Ivdal, the nature of the mystery shifted violently. The first 5 hikers had died of the cold, but the final 4 bore marks of incredible, inexplicable physical trauma. Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignolles had a major skull fracture, so severe that fragments of bone had been pressed into his brain. Yet curiously, there was no external wound on his scalp, no bruising, no laceration. It was as if his skull had been crushed by an invisible uniform pressure. The injuries to Dubinina and Zolotaryov were even more harrowing. Both had suffered extensive rib fractures. Dubinina's chest had been crushed with such force that her ribs had snapped on both sides, and her heart had suffered a massive hemorrhage. Zolotaryov's injuries were similar, with multiple broken ribs on his right side. Dr. Boris Vozrozhdende, the lead medical examiner, compared the force required to inflict such damage to that of a high-speed car accident or a powerful blast wave. Most bafflingly, like Thibeaux-Brignolles, they showed almost no external soft tissue damage. Their skin was intact, despite the shattered bones beneath. Then came the most haunting detail of all, the one that would fuel decades of conspiracy theories. When the examiners looked at Lyudmila Dubinina's face, they found that her tongue was missing. Not just damaged, but gone, rooted out at the base. Her eyes had also been removed, as had Zolotaryov's. The official reports would later attribute this to postmortem decomposition and the action of small scavengers in the damp environment of the ravine. But the image of the young woman, frozen and faceless in the spring melt, became the indelible symbol of a mystery that was only starting.
Beyond the physical trauma, an invisible anomaly emerged from the laboratory results. Lev Ivanov, the lead prosecutor who had taken over the case, grew increasingly suspicious of the site's environment. He ordered a radiochemical analysis of the hikers' clothing. The results were startling. Small but significant amounts of beta radiation were detected on the garments of Kolyadov and Dubinina. Specifically, a sweater and a pair of trousers showed contamination levels that exceeded the natural background radiation. This discovery threw a clinical cold wrench into the proceedings. In 1959, the Soviet Union was deep into the atomic age. Radioactive isotopes suggested something more complex than a simple accident. Yet, strangely, the investigation did not pivot toward a nuclear explanation. Instead, the focus remained on the atmospheric and the physical. By May 1959, the official investigation was abruptly brought to a close. The legal documents reached a conclusion that has since become the hallmark of the Dyatlov enigma. Ivanov wrote that the cause of death was a compelling natural force, which the hikers were unable to overcome. It was a phrase as poetic as it was legally hollow. It offered no specifics, no culprits, and no mechanism of action. It was a bureaucratic shrug of the shoulders, effectively sealing the case while leaving every significant question unanswered. The files were classified and sent to a secret archive, hidden from the public and even the victims' families for decades. This secrecy only fueled the growing suspicion that the state knew more than it was willing to admit, perhaps protecting a military secret or a failed weapons test that had gone horribly wrong in the Ural wilderness. While the official record was sealed, the testimonies of those involved began to circulate in whispers. One persistent report came from hikers led by Sergei Sogrin, trekking 50 kilometers south of the Dyatlov group that same night. They reported seeing strange orange spheres floating in the night sky toward the direction of Kholat Syakhl. These glowing orbs were described as moving slowly, then accelerating and disappearing behind the horizon. Even Lev Ivanov, years later after his retirement, confessed in an interview that he believed these spheres were directly related to the deaths. He suggested they might have been some form of energy or experimental craft that caused a localized atmospheric disturbance, though he had been pressured by high-ranking officials to exclude such observations from the final report. The exclusion of the Mansi people as suspects was another critical, albeit necessary turn. Initially, the local indigenous hunters had been interrogated under the suspicion that the hikers had trespassed on sacred ground. However, the Mansi were seasoned survivors of the taiga and held no animosity toward the students. Furthermore, there were no tracks leading to the tent other than those of the 9 hikers themselves. The snow around the tent was undisturbed by any struggle or external human presence. This lack of tracks also debunked the theory of a cleanup crew or a military liquidator team arriving immediately after the event. If humans had killed the Dyatlov group, they had done so without leaving a single footprint in the waist-deep snow, a feat that defied the physical realities of the Siberian winter. This leaves us with the internal state of the group in their final hours. The boring reality of forensic science often points to a chaotic, desperate struggle for survival against the elements, yet the Dyatlov case refuses to fit neatly into the box of hypothermia. While the first 5 found showed signs of freezing, the injuries of the final 4, the crushed ribs and fractured skulls, remained the central anomaly. If it was an avalanche, why was the tent still standing, albeit collapsed? If it was a windstorm, why was the equipment still inside? The investigators looked at the possibility of infrasound, low-frequency sound waves caused by the wind whipping over the peculiar shape of the mountain. Such waves can induce intense feelings of dread, nausea, and panic in humans, potentially explaining why the hikers would flee their tent in such a state of undress. As the spring of 1959 turned to summer, the Dyatlov Pass was left to the silence of the peaks. The families of the deceased were left with heavy hearts and a closed file. They were told their children had died of unfortunate circumstances, a bitter pill for parents who knew their children were expert woodsmen. The mystery had been born in the snow, nurtured in the morgue, and buried in the archives. But as the decades passed and the Soviet Union eventually began to crumble, the secret classification on those files started to fade. The emergence of the Dyatlov Foundation and the release of previously suppressed documents would eventually bring new eyes to the old evidence. The world was ready to unmask everything.
The transition into the digital age meant that the files once buried in Soviet archives were now being scrutinized by millions across the globe. What was once a local legend became a global obsession, with theories ranging from the plausible to the preposterous. However, the most significant breakthrough did not come from a conspiracy theorist's basement, but from the clinical halls of modern science and a renewed legal inquiry by the Russian authorities in 2019. This reinvestigation was not looking for aliens or secret weapons. It was looking for the mundane, the physical, and the logical. They focused on 3 natural possibilities: an avalanche, a slab avalanche, or a hurricane. For years, critics of the avalanche theory pointed to the relatively shallow slope of Kholat Syakhl. They argued that the pitch was not steep enough to trigger a traditional mountain collapsing slide. Furthermore, there was no debris found over the tent when the searchers arrived. But in 2021, a pair of Swiss researchers, Johann Gaum and Alexander Puzrin, published a study that provided the missing link. Using computer modeling techniques originally developed for Hollywood films like Frozen, they demonstrated how a small-scale slab avalanche could occur on that specific slope. The hikers had inadvertently invited tragedy when they cut a ledge into the snow to level the ground for their tent. This action, combined with the weight of the falling snow and the force of the katabatic winds, created a ticking time bomb. Hours after they had settled in, a heavy slab of compacted snow, perhaps no larger than a car, broke loose from the slope above. It did not bury the tent entirely, but it struck with the force of a hammer. This explains why the hikers cut their way out from the inside. They weren't fleeing a ghost. They were escaping a collapsed, suffocating structure that had just broken the ribs and skulls of several members of their party. This scientific model finally reconciled the horrific internal injuries with the lack of external bruising. When a heavy, soft mass like a slab of snow presses down on a human body against a hard floor, it can crush bone without breaking the skin. In the chaos and darkness, fearing a second larger slide, the group made a collective, desperate decision. They moved toward the tree line, hoping to find shelter and build a fire. This was not a mindless panic induced by infrasound or chemicals, but a calculated, albeit doomed, attempt at survival by experienced woodsmen who understood the lethality of the mountain. As for the lingering supernatural details that have fueled the fire of mystery for 60 years, modern forensics and historical context provide a sobering bucket of cold water. The orange skin and gray hair described at the funerals were the natural results of mummification and intense solar radiation on bodies left in the snow for months. The missing tongue of Lyudmila Dubinina, once seen as a sign of ritual sacrifice, was actually the result of natural decomposition and the activity of small scavengers that inhabit the mountain. When a body lies in a running stream, as hers did for weeks, the softest tissues are always the first to be lost to the elements.
The traces of radiation found on the clothing were also unmasked. Two of the hikers, Krivonischenko and Slobodin, had worked in nuclear facilities. In the 1950s, safety protocols were often lax, and it was common for workers to carry microscopic traces of isotopes on their long-term garments. Even the glowing orbs reported by other hikers in the region that night have a terrestrial explanation. Documents revealed that the Soviet military was conducting R-7 missile tests from the nearby Polyarny Cosmodrome during that exact window. What the witnesses saw were not UFOs, but the exhaust plumes of Cold War technology trailing across the subarctic sky. Ultimately, the frozen secret of Dyatlov Pass was not a secret of malice, but one of mathematics. It was the intersection of a specific slope angle, a layer of unstable snow, and the sheer misfortune of a single night's weather. The mystery persisted because we, as humans, find it difficult to accept that 9 young, vibrant lives could be extinguished by something as boring as physics. We want the world to be more mysterious than it is, filled with monsters and conspiracies, because the alternative, that nature is indifferent to our survival, is far more terrifying. The Dyatlov Foundation continues to honor the memory of the 9, ensuring they are remembered not just as victims of a ghost story, but as brave explorers. The past remains silent now, the snow still shifting under the Ural winds. The files are closed, the science is settled, and the masks have finally been removed. The truth of Kholat Syakhl is a quiet, tragic one. They did everything right, and the mountain took them anyway.